Hello and welcome to this September 13th edition of the X106 podcast. I'm Ryan Elliot. I'm going to be joined by Evan Brown. We're going to talk a little bit of NFL football. We're going to talk some college football, and if we get some time, we're going to talk some Bearcat football as well. So a football-filled Wednesday on your X106 podcast, and that's coming up right now. So, Evan, let's start with recently the 108 modern era nominees for the Hall of Fame were released by the NFL. Let's talk a little bit about some of the names you see on that list and some of the guys that I think and you think should be considered for the Hall of Fame.
Well, immediately, it jumps out. You see the quarterbacks, Donovan McNabb, Steve McNair, stuff like that. And, not a lot of these running backs really, jump out to you. You see big names like Tiki Barber, Eddie George, Corey Dillon. But, when you go to the wide receivers, then those names really start to jump out at you. Guys like Isaac Bruce, Donald Driver. You see Steve Smith, Giant Steve Smith, Terrell Owens, and Chad Ochocinco, formerly known as Chad Johnson. But a lot of good guys on this list, and I think it's going to be a talent-filled class this year.
And I agree with you. And so what happens is 53 offensive players, 38 defensive players, 5 special teamers, 12 coaches on the roster of nominees this year. The list of modern era nominees is going to be reduced to 25 in November, and then 15 finalists come January that then will be voted on to be included in the Hall of Fame. Generally, the class is around 7. That they actually induct into the Hall of Fame, usually a coach or two and an owner or two or something other than a player, and 5 players, give or take. So one thing you mentioned was the quarterbacks, and if you look at, there's a lot of good names, Donovan McNabb being one of them, Randall Cunningham, Steve McNair, a lot of dual threat quarterbacks. Randall Cunningham up until recently, until Michael Vick burst on the scene, really was the quintessential run and gun quarterback. He was
the prototype.
Yeah, he was the greatest running quarterback in NFL history. Donovan McNabb had some legs to get to the outside. Steve McNair as well. Maybe not necessarily runners per se, but they both had no mobility. Rich Gannon had a little bit of mobility. He wasn't the fastest guy in the world, but and Phil Simms as well. But that list of 5 quarterbacks, I think, is going to be difficult to narrow down. I think there will be at least one in the finals as a finalist, but it's going to be tough to narrow down to which one that might be. You look at the running backs, you mentioned kind of a thin class. You look at names like Tiki Barber, Corey Dillon, Eddie George, guys that had pretty good careers, but at the same time, these were guys that played at the same time as, say, a guy like LaDainian Tomlinson, who's already in the Hall of Fame. A guy that was just dominant, and so their careers look a little bit lackluster in comparison to those guys. Also, Roger Craig from back in the day with the 49ers, Ricky Waters as well, a couple of guys from that era. Another guy that played at the same kind of time as LaDainian Tomlinson, and in that was Fred Taylor, who was statistically in that upper echelon of running backs, but didn't play on a great team with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So that, I think, is going to hurt him as well. You mentioned wide receivers. You look at, there is at least one automatic in that wide receiver core, and that's Randy Moss. I would be shocked if he doesn't end up in the Hall of Fame this year.
Absolutely.
As in a lot of people's opinions, the second greatest receiver of all time behind Jerry Rice. And so he's a guy that is pretty much a lock. And then a couple of wide receivers that you mentioned, Donald Driver, you mentioned, Isaac Bruce, a lot of guys that had great careers that were kind of on the edge of a Hall of Fame career, and it'll be interesting to see who they decide deserves to make that next step. I also want to mention a D2 alumnus in Rod Smith, an alumni of the of Missouri Southern State University, Rod Smith, on the list of nominees for the Hall of Fame. So hooray for D2.
And, going back to the wide receivers, we were talking about all these guys that, deserve. Obviously, Randy Moss is one of those guys. One of those guys on the border, actually two, I'd say they're kind of similar in their play styles, was Chad Johnson and Terrell Owens, who I think they're kind of dark horse candidates to get in this year. It's kind of packed wide receiver, talent-wise this year. I just like to see Terrell Owens and Chad Johnson. Obviously, Hines Ward is on the end of that list, and he is kind of lackluster in the the talent department. He had a tremendous career in Pittsburgh. Don't get me wrong, but he's just a little bit more overshadowed by some of these more, I'm not going to say more talented. These guys that have had better careers.
Well, and you look at a guy like Chad Johnson and Terrell Owens as well. They had great careers. Played on some very good teams, but I think a lot of that is overshadowed by the off-the-field issues that both of them had.
Of course.
Terrell, they were both talkers. Chad Johnson would get an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty basically every game.
Yeah.
And Terrell Owens had his issues with coaching staffs. He had his issues with teammates. That, I think, kind of overshadows how good their careers were.
I agree.
And that's part of why maybe they're on the fence and not they're not necessarily favorites to make this final 15 per se. And that's probably why, not because they didn't have the careers to do it, but because a lot of people see the off-the-field issues and struggle with that.
Yeah, and you wonder if, these off-the-field issues weren't a part of their careers, just how soon they may have made it into the Hall of Fame. So it's just something to think about.
Yep, that's true. That's true. It's something you look at. We also have 38 nominees on the defensive side, highlighted, of course, by Ray Lewis and Brian Urlacher at linebacker, but also guys like Steve Atwater, former Broncos safety, Rondé Barber of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, guys like John Lynch, who that's a big name to put up there. Brian Dawkins as well. Two of those guys in their time in the early 2000s, especially Dawkins with the Eagles, Lynch with the Broncos. They were the hard-hitting safeties. You did not want to run into Brian Dawkins, and you did not want to run into John Lynch. They were that guy. They were, you look at a guy like Cam Chancellor now.
Oh, yeah.
They were the Cam Chancellor of their day, or Cam Chancellor might be the Brian Dawkins or the John Lynch of his day. A guy like Ty Law, who was the best corner in the game unequivocally for a long time. Rodney Harrison played on a lot of those same Patriots defenses as Ty Law as well. Darren Woodson. There are a lot of names at defensive back, and defensive linemen as well. Kind of a thin class there. You see a guy like Richard Seymour, who had a few good years but kind of fell off the wagon at the end. Neil Smith, a former Kansas City Chief, had some good careers as well. Simeon Rice, the defensive end. But outside of that, not as much going for the defensive line. And, this is a class that a lot of times people will look at all of these names and go, why are there so many people here? A lot of these people don't deserve to get into the Hall of Fame, which, while that is true, they have to start with a large list of people because there are so many different comparisons. And that's one of the issues in trying to whittle it down to 15 people is that there are, you can make an argument for probably 70 of these 108,
absolutely.
A good argument. And that's where they're going to find difficulty, especially with the guys that are on the fence, like you mentioned, like Terrell Owens, like Chad Johnson, like, Teddy Bruschi, Willie McGinnis, Clay Matthews, the older Clay Matthews, Carl Mecklenburg, guys like that are, well, they had a pretty good career. Was it a Hall of Fame career? That's yet to be determined. But
absolutely,
that's just part of this 108-person list for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. A couple of coaches as well, kickers, punters. Gary Anderson, who I think should be a lock. Gary Anderson's one of the best kickers of all time. And you look at a guy like Don Coryell, Bill Cowher, Mike Holmgren, Jimmy Johnson, Chuck Knox, and we mentioned Dick Vermeil as well in the list for coaches, so we may see one or two of those. Marty Schottenheimer as well, the former Chiefs coach. We may see a few of those in that finalist class as well. So let's turn our attention to last week in the NFL. Week 1, which of course started with the 42-27 win by the Chiefs over the Patriots to kick the season off, and just kind of continued from there. There were a lot of good games Sunday. The Browns giving the Steelers a surprise game.
Run for their money.
Yeah, I was not necessarily impressed with the Cleveland Browns. More so, I was kind of
unimpressed.
Yeah, unimpressed with the Steelers in that game. Raiders playing a very good game against the Titans. The Jaguars blowing out the Houston Texans.
10 sacks.
On the road.
Yeah.
They went to Houston and just blew out the Texans.
And granted, they have the quarterback issues, but now Deshaun Watson has taken the reins from Tom Savage. And honestly, I really just feel bad for Tom Savage. I mean, that offensive line just could not keep out Calais Campbell.
No.
And I mean, how many sacks did he end with? I think it was at least 4 or 5. He broke the record.
Something along those lines.
I mean, as a team, and you go on the road, to Houston, that's not an easy place to play, and you sack the opposing quarterbacks 10 total times. That's just impressive, in itself.
And that was, it's tough to as an offense that doesn't necessarily trust your quarterback in Tom Savage. Take a look at Calais Campbell had 4 sacks, ended up with 4 sacks, and as a team, I'm not sure exactly how many they ended up with. It was a lot.
Almost positive it was 10. I'm pretty sure I saw that.
But yeah, it was that was not a good game for that Texans offensive line. And so, a lot of teams were very unimpressive. I saw a lot of teams that I looked at and went, really? Really? You talk about, there were also some teams that were really impressive. The Philadelphia Eagles looked really good. Carson Wentz had another year under his belt. He looked fantastic.
The Los Angeles Rams winning 46-9 over Indianapolis. I mean, and obviously Indianapolis isn't going to be kind of a team that rolls over for you.
Yes.
But anyway, you look at what they did last year, and it's a complete turnaround.
Yeah.
I'm just happy with Sean McVay and, what he's doing with that program.
Well, yeah, and the Rams, you talk about a team like the Rams, yeah, they looked really impressive, but I think a lot of people need to remember that they played a Colts defense that I potentially by the end of the year could be considered one of the worst defenses in NFL history.
Yeah.
So it's pretty abysmal on that side of the ball for the Colts, but the Vikings looking good on Monday night.
Yep.
And the Chargers getting their hearts broken once again.
Yeah. It's a theme.
Yeah. They just they can't seem to open the year on the right foot. Ever.
Although I'm happy with Keenan Allen. Obviously he came back from that awful injury last year. Phillip Rivers has been raving about him all preseason, and he's back to normal. They have the crazy chemistry you wouldn't really expect. But yeah, he came back. I'm pretty sure he had 5 receptions, 35 yards, and a touchdown. Not a bad game considering you're out the whole last year. Another team that really just fell this year. After week 1 was Arizona Cardinals losing obviously their best player, David Johnson. I think Bruce Arians said the other day they're hoping to have him back by Christmas, and that's.
Yeah, he'd be one of those guys that's on IR with intent to return. But he'll be available. They can take him off IR by week 8, I believe, is the number.
Yep.
But it'll probably be after that.
Yep.
So let's now move to week 2 and give me some of your best games of week 2 that you're seeing. And I'll give you some of mine as well. I guess I'll start. I'll give you some time to think about it. But I'm looking at Vikings-Steelers on Fox at noon on Sunday. That looks like a good game at home for the Steelers after people are going to be questioning a little bit. You won by 3 over the Cleveland Browns in week 1.
Let's see what you can do with a better team.
Yeah. Now you're playing a Vikings team that looked really good. Dalvin Cook looks really good. So the Steelers' defense is going to have to show up in that one. And then the one other game that I am most interested in would probably be, Cowboys-Broncos Sunday afternoon. That could be a good game. We'll get the true test of that Broncos offense against the Cowboys, as well as Packers-Falcons on Sunday night. So those are some of the games that I'm looking forward to this week.
I'd say the game that stands out most to me is that Titans-Jaguars game. It's a kind of proving ground for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and they took it to Houston last week, as we talked about earlier. But it's kind of like we were talking about with the Steelers Vikings. It's like another test for them. You go to the next upper echelon of the teams, and the Titans aren't just going to roll over for them, and they have a much better they have a much better offense than Houston does. So it'll be interesting to see with what that Jaguars defense does, especially Jalen Ramsey, who may just have one of the most absurd breakout years in the NFL. He went from he made the all-rookie team last year, and I'm sure he'll probably go all-pro this year. Although another game I'm interested to see is the Washington Redskins versus the LA Rams. We mentioned the Rams also, had a great week 1. It'll be interesting to see if they can have that better week 2.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if their offense can perform against an NFL defense in the Washington Redskins. And I don't mean to bag too much on the Indianapolis Colts, but they might as well have the 2015 Washington State defense out there.
Really?
It's without Vontae Davis, it's tough. It's going to be tough for them this year, but maybe they'll turn it around. Maybe they'll find some pieces. We'll see. But I agree. Redskins-Rams looks like a really good game, and Jaguars and Titans as well. You mentioned to see if that Jaguars defense can stack up to the Titans, who looked good against the Raiders, but just couldn't get things done last week. All right. Next up, we're going to talk about some college football. Don't miss it. You're listening to the X106 podcast. And welcome back to the X106 podcast. I'm Ryan Elliott. I'm here with Evan Brown. We're going to talk a little bit of college football, a little bit of what we saw this past weekend, and what's coming up next weekend in the college football world. Evan, what did you see this last weekend? What was your I'll say it, game of the week for this week?
It shouldn't be a surprise. It's the Oklahoma-Ohio State game, and especially with all the the backlash that Baker Mayfield has been receiving after his little flag incident, which honestly I didn't have a problem with, and I just feel like I have a friend that's a really big Ohio State fan, so I got to be careful how I say this. But I feel like they were just complaining too much, and I feel like if you don't want that sort of thing to happen, then just don't lose at home.
Yeah, and that's exactly what a couple of former players were saying is if you don't want that, then like you said, don't lose at home.
Mm-hmm. It was harmless.
Yeah,
I thought.
He didn't hurt anybody.
No.
But yeah, last week was a good week in college football. I thought I really enjoyed Iowa State. That game came down to the wire in overtime there. Clemson-Auburn was at both a really, really bad and a really, really good game. Both teams just couldn't get the ball anywhere, but both defenses played really well, and it was a close game, So that was one of the games I enjoyed. And the other one was, even though I picked Notre Dame last week, Georgia-Notre Dame was a good game as well to see. The Notre Dame offense just couldn't get anything going, and it's surprising. Georgia comes into South Bend in prime time without their starting quarterback, and Notre Dame just couldn't take advantage.
Just tore them apart.
And one other game that I really enjoyed last week was Louisville, North Carolina. North Carolina gave the Cardinals a game.
And I thought that game was a lot closer than it should have been.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, a 12-point game at the end, but it was within a possession basically all game long.
Yeah.
And Lamar Jackson had another great game, and he is skyrocketing himself to the top of the Heisman conversation again. So, and it will have to continue this week, which is a perfect segue into talking about this coming week in college football, because I think a lot of people's game of the week this week will be Clemson at Louisville.
Oh, yeah. And, I mean, segueing right back into Lamar Jackson, you can't get away from the guy. But, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what he can do, obviously against the defending national champions. I mean, that defense is still locked down tight. So, I mean, we'll see if he can run all over him like he has been doing. And if he does, I mean, I would say he's the very early favorite to win that Heisman Trophy.
Well, and he's one of those guys that he has already hit the 1,000 total yards mark in 2 games. In 2 games, he's got 1,010 total yards and 8 total touchdowns. It's not unheard of because it's been done before, but, every person that's done it won or had a chance to win the Heisman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so he's looked really good. The problem for Louisville has been their defense. Mm-hmm. They haven't been able to keep teams out of the end zone.
I agree.
They couldn't keep North Carolina out of the end zone. Mm-mm. They couldn't. And so Clemson's got a good offense. They've got a better defense.
Yep.
So if Louisville struggles at all in this game, then it's very possible Clemson can just come out and just run all over them at Papa John's Cardinal Stadium there in Louisville.
And who knows? I mean, maybe Lamar Jackson has that another switch. He can go up another level and maybe just carry him to the end of the game and, possibly get him a win. But
Very true. Very true. What are some of the other games you're looking forward to this weekend in college football?
Well, I mean, a lot of people probably wouldn't say this game, but Oregon State, Washington State. There's just something about the game, the matchup I really like. It's at Washington State, and I think that they'll have a better chance of winning. Oregon State isn't, a team to write home about, but they're also not one to sleep on. So I think it'll be interesting, and I think it's going to be one of those games that's really high scoring and might possibly go into overtime.
And what's interesting to me is Washington State are 21-point favorites because Oregon State is not the Oregon State team that they used to be.
No.
Which, you say what you will, but maybe the Pac-12's not as good as people thought it was this year.
Yeah.
Washington State did get the 3 overtime win against Boise State last week, which was a game we didn't talk about, but because it was a late game, and I don't know that either of us watched it. We were both probably asleep, but it was seeing the highlights. It was an incredible game, and at home, 21-point favorites. Now, I might pick against the spread, but I don't know that I would pick Oregon State total.
Yeah,
I don't think I'd pick them to win, but. That could definitely be an interesting game and potentially a trap game for Washington State if they come in with the wrong idea about Oregon State. The other game I find interesting is LSU Mississippi State, another potential trap game. Mississippi State not necessarily picked as one of the favorites in the SEC, but only a 7-point underdog at home against LSU. So that's a game worth watching to see. Potentially if Mississippi State can take down LSU. And really, this week is, I don't want to say devoid of good games, but
there's just not a lot of great matchup.
It's a thin week.
I mean, compared to the last 2 weeks, we had a 1 versus 3, and then whatever.
And 1 versus 4 in week 1, and 2 versus 5 in week 2.
Can't get much better than that.
We don't really have that game this week. We've got Tennessee, Florida, 2 ranked teams, but Florida just looked terrible against Michigan, and Tennessee struggled with Georgia Tech in week 1. So that's going to be a game. It's going to be a good game. Florida's actually favored in that game because it's in Gainesville. That'll be interesting. Oklahoma State, Pittsburgh, and we're missing out on Miami, Florida State. That was probably going to be the game of the week, but we're not going to see that one this week. They postponed that to, I believe, October 11th. Or something, sometime in October, they postponed that game too because of the hurricanes in Florida. And the other game Friday night is Illinois South Florida. They're actually going to play that in Tampa at Raymond James Stadium. Rather than postponing it, they moved it from South Florida's campus to Raymond James Stadium in Tampa. 22nd ranked South Florida is favored by 17.5 points in that game. Illinois is 2-0 coming in, but if you take a look at their previous schedule, they beat Ball State 24-21 and Western Kentucky 20-7. So not exactly the toughest strength of schedule in the world. But nonetheless, that game will be at Raymond James Stadium, ESPN, 6 o'clock on Friday night. So let's take a minute and real quick here, recap what we saw from take a move into Division II and recap what we saw from the Bearcats Thursday night in Topeka.
Well, it was an uncharacteristically slow start, I'd say. Obviously, the safety in the first quarter, and that was the only points we scored, and then a field goal in the second quarter. It was 5-0 at halftime, which is more of a baseball score in the seventh inning stretch. But, it wasn't an awful game. It really wasn't. Zach Martin had a great game, 30 for 40, 238 yards, a touchdown. He got sacked a couple times, but, it's to be expected. Cameron Wilcox had an all right game, 20 attempts, about 69 yards and a touchdown. Sean Bain had a touchdown again. Our offense is producing, just not as much as we're used to. We still won, so you're not going to hear any complaints from me.
And I don't think it was a bad win. 20-14, people look at and go, okay, Washburn was a 500 team last year, or basically 500. They went 6-5, but Washburn was pretty much a 500 team last year. Why was it a 6-point game?
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a bad loss. You go into Topeka against an improved Washburn team from last year. They're very physical, and your defensive line, between the four of them, has one combined collegiate start, and that was Austin Eskew in week 1 of this season.
Yeah.
And that's, now they get a chance to, okay, they escaped Topeka with a win. They did what they needed to do. And I guess I don't want to say escaped, but they got out of Topeka with a win and did what they needed to do to get that win. Now they get to move on. They head to Nebraska Kearney on Saturday, and then the next Saturday's family weekend at home against Missouri Southern. These are two teams that are at or around the bottom of the MIAA most of the time. Of course, Kearney getting a good win in week 1 against Missouri Western, but these are two teams that this might be a confidence builder these next 2 weeks for this Bear, especially for the offense.
I agree, and they need they need two confidence builders right before the Central Missouri game at Arrowhead. That's going to be a great one to watch, and that's coming up on us quick. I didn't realize it was in 15 days. So be on the lookout for that game. By the way, we'll be broadcasting that from Arrowhead.
We will. That's true.
Yeah, it'll be a good time.
And you'll also hear us on September 23rd for Missouri Southern for Family Day as well. And let's just real quick preview a couple of other Bearcat fall sports. We take a look at volleyball. Is a team that they're headed down to Fort Smith, Arkansas tomorrow. For the Arkansas Fort Smith Invitational. They take on Newman University tomorrow at 4:30. Then Friday they have University of West Florida at 11:30. Arkansas Fort Smith at 7, and then they play Henderson State on Saturday, and that game is at 4:30 as well. And that's kind of their last test before they head into conference play. I talked to Coach Amy Worth the other day, and she was talking about how she's very proud of the improvements that her team has made over this last couple of weeks. They had a good Saturday last Saturday at Quincy, Illinois, beating Wayne State and beating MSU Moorhead. She's proud of the improvements that her ladies have made, and she's looking for a way to kind of solidify that group and that set that they want heading into conference play. And that's kind of what this next tournament's going to be, is making sure they have all the pieces in place, making sure they're set for conference play. And it's been kind of an empty fall semester here at Northwest thus far. We've had one home football game, and the volleyball team isn't at home until September 29th against Southwest Baptist. The soccer team's been at home a couple of times. They've been home once, actually, I guess. They were at home this past game, and they're also playing, I believe it is Thursday night. They were at home against Rockhurst Friday rather. They're at Missouri Western, and that is against a conference opponent, but doesn't count toward the conference standings. A good preview of some of the top teams in the conference this coming week. Friday at Missouri Western, Sunday at home against Central Missouri. So we're going to get some home soccer action as well. Tennis is having a home meet as well. Cross country had the Bearcat Open recently. So it hasn't been totally dead, but we've only had one basically from each sport at this point, 0 from volleyball. And so looking forward to kind of get the schedule rolling. We've got, Family Day, Arrowhead, and then UCO at home for the football team. The volleyball team has back-to-back home matches on the 29th and 30th of September. So then we're going to get the fall sports rolling here at Northwest. And you can hear a lot, if not all of it, here on X106. Me and Devin and Evan for the football broadcast, as well as you're going to hear Max Moore, Trevor Mater with the pregame show, and Evan's going to be helping us out on the sidelines.
All right.
Mr. Injury Update.
Yeah,
Evan
that's
Brown.
Me, I guess so. I'll take that nickname.
The eyes on the sideline, always watching. So we're excited about that. We're going to get ready for the next broadcast on the 23rd. And with that will close out our X106 podcast for this Wednesday, September 13th. Thanks for listening. This has been, once again, me, Evan Brown, the X106 podcast.